welcome to the Liz Earle Wellbeing Show. Oh my goodness, buckle up, because in this week's episode we are going to be talking to Sarah Warley, the pioneering founder of The Key Clinic, a practice that brings together a wealth of drug-free, cutting-edge treatments all under one roof to help improve the quality of life of those with a wide range of concerns. Now, Sarah holds 2 degrees in experimental psychology from the University of Oxford, but it was only after the birth of her 4 children that she noticed the sharp increase in childhood learning and behavioural difficulties. She also saw a gap in support here, finding that there was very little help or practical advice available to parents to overcome these concerns. This led her back to further study, where she qualified as a neurophysiological psychologist and an auditory integration therapist to tackle the root causes of many of these behavioural problems, such as depression, anxiety, ADHD, autism, and more. She later founded the clinic, which brings evidence-based solutions to children and adults struggling with their learning, and some of the testimonies are absolutely astounding. Using revolutionary therapies for the brain, Sarah and her team have been unlocking children's potential in a way that is unique to them, and I really cannot wait for you to hear what she has to say. And don't forget that if you would like to watch our chat today, the podcast video is available on the Liz Earle Wellbeing YouTube channel. And as always, I am looking forward to hearing your thoughts on Instagram after the show. So let's get straight into hearing it from Sarah. So welcome, Sarah. I absolutely am beyond thrilled to have you here. And I can't tell you how excited I am to have some of your time and just the opportunity to explore some of these really fascinating, completely groundbreaking and unbelievably helpful techniques for so many, young and old. So welcome.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Well, I said in my intro that you started, obviously you did degrees at Oxford, you were studying psychology. Where did your journey very briefly take you after university?
Gosh, well, I did a whole range of different things after university. I was living in New York for many years. I kind of lived in lots of countries around the world. I've done quite a lot of postgrad training because, I've always been fascinated in biology and psychology. So I studied something called neurophysiological psychology. I studied, brain biochemistry at somewhere called the Walsh Institute in the States. I've studied auditory integration training. I studied things like low-level laser therapy in Toronto. I'm eternally studying and training in areas that are sort of cutting-edge, evidence-based that can make a difference to people's lives. I'm just eternally researching.
Well, you are certainly making a big difference to a lot of people's lives. And I first came across your work with an organisation that you set up called The Key Clinic in London, which so impressed me because you are looking at all these different factors that can influence spectrum disorders, cognitive function, behaviour. And what I love about your approach, and I guess hearing you talk about your background explains it, is there are so many different facets to it. And it was actually quite hard when thinking about this podcast to think, which area should we talk about? Because there are so many. And at the Key Clinic, you bring it all together, which is just so very interesting. But should we talk a little bit first about spectrum disorders? I know that a lot of children who come to you, for example, are diagnosed with being on the spectrum. So it'd be quite interesting to talk about kind of what that means and how that looks like from your perspective, things like ADD, ADHD, OCD, hyperactivity. I mean, who are the sort of people that come through your doors?
Yes. Well, we have a whole wide raft, and it's children and it's adults because we often treat the children and then we treat adults as well. But I mean, it can be anything from dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, as you said, ADD, ADHD, sort of Asperger's. I'd say higher functioning autistic spectrum, children with depression, night terrors, anxiety. So it's a whole wide raft, and also individuals who perhaps don't have a label. Often, we'll treat children who are just sort of underperforming relative to how smart they are, and their parents and teachers just don't understand how they can't translate that through onto paper. So it's a very wide range that we're treating.
And what
Yeah.
are some of the
So,
things?
and in terms of,
No, go on.
apologies, carry on.
No, sorry, but it's because we're remote, so it's slightly we get a little bit of delay sometimes. I was going to ask you where you start when somebody walks through the door. Do you start with looking at brain chemistry in terms of nutrients? And I was talking to Dr. Bock on this podcast just recently, actually, over in New York, talking about the inflamed brain and looking at nutrients and how that can help and how treating the brain differently from just neurotypical medication. Do you start with that, or do you start with physical things? Because one of the things that I want to also talk about here are the retained childhood reflexes, and to look at some of the things like the Moro reflex, which seems to impact so many children. What's your starting point, really?
So right, you're so right. Well, our starting point is when someone contacts the clinic, we book up what we call an initial screening consultation. It takes about an hour, and this is generally just for the parent or the adult if they themselves are being treated. And it's a questionnaire which gives us a full developmental history, and it's been researched to be able to predict with about a 90% degree of accuracy where those difficulties are likely to be coming from. So we will go through that, first of all, almost as a triage to then deciding where it is we begin. Because the next step is going to be carrying out very specific assessments. And we do a lot of assessing at the clinic. We don't want to recommend anything unless we know it's going to be a game changer. And this is why we have all these different things under one roof, because it just struck me that there are many, if you've got difficulties, if you or your family have difficulties and problems, there's no clear roadmap of where to go or what to do. And there are lots of individual specialists, all, good at what they do, but they only do that one thing. And, there's a saying, if all you've got is a hammer, every problem's a nail. And this is why we want to have everything under one roof. So that we can be objective. We can look and say, well, actually, I know you may have heard of us for the retained reflex work, but for you, it's completely irrelevant. You actually need to start with this if you want to see some change. So I would say, in broad terms, if you've got someone who is very hyperactive, if they've got a diagnosis of ADHD, a true ADHD, or autistic spectrum, if they're extremely depressed, those sorts of individuals, I would start with the biomedical side of it. I'd start by looking at the biochemistry. And we can talk more about that, but looking at exactly where the imbalances are and what problems those could be causing. And we sort of work from there upwards. So, if then there is a need for neurodevelopmental work, if there's a need for auditory work, if there's a need for some sort of coaching later on, then we can deal with it. But I think there is a particular order in which to treat certain things to get the best effect.
Yeah. So when you're looking at a bionutrient regime to start with, or a screening, and I have seen these forms, and it's unbelievably complex and detailed, that the number of blood tests and urine tests that you can analyze. I mean, it is forensic. And you send blood and urine samples, to clinics in Germany, and they go off to, specialist screening places in some cases in the UK. And what sort of things are you looking for? What sort of things are you looking for, perhaps, that might be too high or too low, and certain deficiencies?
Yes. Well, I think if we rewind a little bit and talk about what the work is based on, and really it's come out of the Walsh Institute in the US, which is a non-for-profit organisation that's been around for the past 40 years or so. And there's someone called Dr. William Walsh, who's now 88 years old, who's been doing really groundbreaking work there. And he worked with the late, great Dr. Carl Pfeiffer, who is very well known for his work in the same field. In fact, he was up for the Nobel Prize for this work. Yeah. What they did was analyse the biochemical imbalances and differences that seem to underpin most forms of mental health problem or behavioural problem. And, Dr. Walsh started off looking at violent young offenders in prison and saying, well, what's different about their biochemistry? How have they ended up here? And what's really fascinating is, out of the hundreds, in fact, thousands of chemical reactions taking place in the brain, what they found is that there seem to be 6 main areas that seem to be causal factors for the majority of mental health and behavioural problems. It actually boils down from all this great complexity to 6 main imbalances which we tend to see. So those blood tests that we're doing, or urine tests, are specifically looking at those things. And it's sort of a very advanced approach to it, I think, because if you look at the existing psychiatric medical model, it's very much prescribe and see. We don't know, you're depressed, let's give you an SSRI, serotonin reuptake inhibitor, because we're going to assume you don't have enough serotonin in your brain.
Right.
And we're going to assume that that's the cause of your depression. Now, William Walsh, for example, would say, well, yeah, that's true for 38% of the population. There's 38% of the depressed population that happen to not have enough serotonin. They're what's called undermethylated. But there are 5 distinct types of depression. And in fact, there's another 20% who are what's called overmethylated. In other words, they've got too much of this stuff. They've got too much serotonin. They've got too much dopamine. Now, if you give that individual an SSRI, they become worse. They become significantly worse, and they may even become suicidally depressed. And an interesting fact is 18 out of the past 20 school shootings in America, those kids had just been put on SSRIs, again, without any form of testing. 18 out of 20.
18 out of 20.
So
why isn't that not headline news?
Because we don't test it was. And Dr. Walsh has been lobbying the US government saying, I'm not against drugs, but for goodness sake, test. Don't just dip your toe in the water and prescribe.
Yeah.
And that is the current psychiatric model in the country. We try it and we see how it goes. We don't test.
I am truly shocked by that.
So to me, that's quite terrifying. It's quite terrifying.
It is. The wider impact for society of having people who are going to go and have such an extreme reaction to give them these drugs without testing and have them, and we know that the rates of depression and suicidal tendencies and all of these have increased manifold, over the last 18 months because of the current global situation. That is truly terrifying. I want to come back and pick you up. You say that there are 6 nutrient pathways, if you like, that come up time and time again. What are they?
Well, I've mentioned undermethylation, overmethylation. So that's, as I said, to do with the serotonin levels, with the dopamine levels. Zinc copper imbalances account for a lot. Something called hypercupremia means having too much copper in your system. That's the cause of postnatal depression. And again, if you're feeling terrible after you give birth, you'll go and see a doctor, you'll get given an SSRI, and it probably won't have much effect. And that's because when we're pregnant, the level of copper in our bodies goes up 200%. Now, most people, after they give birth, can excrete that from their system. Over the next sort of 2-3 weeks, they're able to get rid of it. But if you happen to be born with a genetic snip, a little mutation, that means that your body is not as capable of doing that, then you end up with this huge amount of copper staying in the system, and that causes extreme anxiety, overproduction of norepinephrine, underproduction of dopamine, and at its extreme form, it causes psychosis. So the answer, the treatment, and Walsh has 98% effectiveness in this treatment, is a slow and gradual increase in zinc. And if you do that, your body flushes out the copper. It needs zinc to be able to do it. But you have to be careful. It has to be controlled. You don't go too fast or you end up with what they call a sort of copper dump in the system. But anyway, I'm sorry, I'm talking about that too much. But
no, it's absolutely fascinating. I have never heard that. I've never heard it said so black and white that postnatal depression is caused by high copper. I mean, that's a very bold statement to make, Sarah.
You've got large quantitative studies that prove it. I was trying to persuade Oxford University to take this up and run a study on it because they really should.
Yes.
Because I'm very confident in the results on it. And again, there's a knee-jerk reaction to reach for one thing. Pyrrole disorder can be another imbalance.
Can we talk about that? So what is pyrrole disorder? And I know that talking about the Walsh studies and looking at the rates of violent young offenders in institutions, am I right in saying that 80% of a sample who were tested were found to have pyrrole disorder?
Almost, no. It was within the ADHD population. 90%.
Right.
90% happen to have the zinc copper imbalance that I
Mm.
mentioned. Now, when we understand what that imbalance does, it causes too much norepinephrine and adrenaline and not enough dopamine. So if you think of stimulant meds, that's exactly the two things they're trying to address, okay? But the whole point about the work with Walsh is that you can treat it using very targeted doses of nutrients, vitamins, minerals, amino acids, that will have the same impact. It'll increase the dopamine, reduce the norepinephrine without the side effects and the drugs. But anyway, 30% of the ADHD population happen to have this thing called pyrrole disorder. And
Ah,
it's a
okay.
genetically inherited problem. But you're right in that it does tend to be the ones that are really violent. Can be violent, can be Jekyll
Mm.
and Hyde, tend to have huge mood swings, huge anxiety. There are a load of symptoms that go with it. You tend to be very pale for your ethnicity, circles under the eyes. These individuals tend to be night owls. They stay up really late, no appetite for breakfast in the morning. There might be food cravings for strange things, salty things and spicy things, hypersensitive to lights. So there are a whole load of traits that happen to go with pyrrole disorder. And what it fundamentally is, we test it by the level of pyrroles in the urine. And if it's above a certain level, then you have pyrrole disorder. And these pyrroles, we all have some pyrroles in the urine, but when you have too much, these are proteins that strip the body of zinc and vitamin B6. So if you've got pyrrole disorder and you happen to be born with that, then it means you're not going to be able to absorb those things. And so these individuals also have very high levels of oxidative stress in their system. And you find that all the calming neurotransmitters, the GABA, the serotonin are reduced, and the excitatory ones are increased. So they tend to be histrionic, volatile
Hmm.
individuals.
I do
And
know a
yet
few of
it is
those.
high. So
I'd,
we all know
I'd,
some of
I'd
those.
love to get
We
them
all know.
all tested for pyrrole disorder because, from what you're saying, is that something as really
Yeah.
simple as a genetic SNP, a genetic variance that they've been born with, that's manifesting in this behavior, can just be calmed
Yeah.
with potentially a judicious use of vitamin B6 and zinc.
Absolutely. And high levels of antioxidants. And what you
Right.
need to do is sort of mega dose at the beginning to get things to a normal level, and then you can reduce to a maintenance dose. But these are individuals who are always going to need a maintenance dose
Mm.
because they have the best diet in the world. They could be popping a multivitamin every day, but it's still not going to be enough for them
No.
to normalize that brain biochemistry. Again, it's beyond people's control. These are how many children in the class are told they're naughty, they're disobedient, oppositional
Yes.
defiance. They fall into this category generally. But it's not their fault. They can't control it. It's just something they're born with, and it runs in families. If you've got it, 50% chance your child has. If both parents have it, 75% chance their child has it. And
Gosh.
it's worse. With ADHD generally, it gets worse if that child gets sick or they're going through a growth spurt, because those are the times when their zinc gets used up even further. Okay, so often we
Really?
give these supplements, these shoot up in height first, and then the behavior starts to balance. So, yeah, if they're going through a stressful time, they need more.
They need more zinc. That is really
Mm.
fascinating. I have to say, as a mother of five and going through very different characteristic traits with all of mine and seeing
Yeah,
behavior changes and also this genetic connection. And I would imagine that some parents might come to you with a child, maybe who's on the spectrum, who's being diagnosed with ADD or ADHD or autism, and then things start to become clearer in terms of the parents' history. And they might think, well,
yeah,
actually, gosh, if this is a genetic characteristic, is this something that, I have also been, suffering from or
yeah.
living with? Is it ever too late? Can we start to correct these nutritional imbalances in much later life if we become aware of them?
Absolutely, we can. It's never too late to correct them, and that's exactly what happens. And that's why, really, we're not just a children's clinic.
Sure.
We treat the adults as well. In fact, we're in the process of developing loads of programs specifically for adults.
Yeah.
No, on two levels, it's not too late. You can always correct the chemistry. And also with the other side of the work we do at the clinic, the brain is actually very plastic, what they call plastic, which means it can be rewired if given the right stimulation. It's plastic from cradle to grave. So we always think, oh, it's only children with flexible brains. No, what happens is we just become complacent later on, and we think, well, I know how to do everything in life as good as possible. I didn't need to learn that other language. I didn't.
Yeah.
But that's precisely when we should be doing those things.
That is really fascinating, and that is absolutely what I would love to talk about. You have made me, and your team, and doing research into your work have made me so much more aware of these really fascinating things, if you like, called retained childhood reflexes. And I've learned a whole new language of, I don't know, Morrow and TLR and all sorts of things. Can we go back and look at, what are we talking about here? What are these reflexes? What happens when we're born? We're supposed to lose certain reflexes. Some of us don't. And then that has an impact in later life. I'd love to explore that.
Yeah, again, it's just I'm fascinated eternally by this whole thing. But when we're born, our brains are only about 20% developed. And we know that within that first year of life...
Oh, sorry.
it's
Sorry, Sarah. Lily's just talking.
I'm going to just close the kitchen door.
Lils, I think she can just hear somebody.
Oh, okay.
I think there was a bit of outside noise, but that's fine. That's a really good stopping point because we can...
Yeah.
That's very fascinating. I'm sorry about the delay on the line. We'll just have to try and sort of not talk over each other. And Harry will be fine because the audio, he will, he's our sound engineer. He will make it perfect.
So maybe do
brilliant.
Yeah. So then Sarah can talk about the retained reflexes. Yeah. So I'll just lead in with a bit of that. Thank you, my love. I mean, I would really love to pick up on that because that side of it,
albeit briefly.
Oh, good. Yes. Because that side of things is just so fascinating. Can we take a real close look into that element of your work now?
Yeah. So retained reflexes, when people talk about that, they're talking about these reflexes that we see within the first year of a baby's life. And when a baby's born, the brain's only about 20% developed. And what happens in that first year is a period of incredibly rapid brain growth. And a large part of the way in which that happens is through this series of little reflexes. They're called primitive reflexes. And it's the same for all of us. One of them comes up, gets stimulated, then it inhibits. Then the next one comes up and gets stimulated, and it inhibits. And you can see particular periods in that baby's development when there are these reflexes present. Now, they should have completed their job by the time a baby reaches their first birthday. But 9 times out of 10, when we look at people who have learning, behavioural difficulties such as dyslexia, etc., we find they have still got these retained reflexes. And what happens when they hang around past their sell-by date? They sort of mess everything up. They interfere with your balance, with your coordination. They interfere directly with eye tracking, so you can't track horizontally across a page, or eyes can't converge together. They interfere with your emotional responses to things. They can make you prone to anxiety. They can make you fidgety. They can make it more likely your child continues to wet the bed. They're like gremlins. They can create all sorts of problems when they're hanging around past when they should have been there. So a large part of the work that we do is it's almost to turn the clock back and say, okay, so it didn't quite develop in the way it was meant to first time round. Let's go back and re-stimulate. Let's give the body a second chance to develop. And we do that through these very targeted neurodevelopmental exercises. So they're little movements, baby-like movements, that people have to do every day over a period of time until that reflex has had enough stimulation that it throws in the towel and it's gone. And then we move to the next one and the next one. Yeah, until they're fully mature.
That's so fascinating. So the one that I have become aware of, which is possibly the one that's most talked about, is the Morrow reflex. And that seems to be the fight or flight, the startle, when you startle a baby and the baby just sort of, jumps like this. And then, so are you saying that that's a reflex that we're born with? I guess it's a form mechanism of self-defense to put us into fight or flight mode really quickly. And are you saying that we're supposed to lose that? But for some people, particularly those who may have spectrum issues, they haven't lost it, But if you recognize it, you can then, kind of retrain the body to lose it so they become calmer. Is that the idea?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. It's an early infant survival reflex, the morrow, and I'm sure any parents listening will remember it. It's any change to the baby's environment, and they fling out their arms and legs, and they have this big inhalation of breath, and then they hold their breath, and you think, oh my God, are they ever going to breathe again? And then the second part, they cling on like this. And it's a survival reflex, because if you think evolutionarily, that newborn, if they're put down in any environment and there's any sudden change to that environment, there's an alarm cry to the parent, there's a big load of oxygen and adrenaline coursing through their system, and then they're clinging on. So it's a survival reflex. It's the reason a baby takes their first breath. And if they're not breathing, the first thing a doctor will do is stimulate that reflex to get them to breathe. Now, should have gone by about 3-4 months of age.
Really?
And then we evolve something called the adult startle response, which is quite different. But it hasn't gone for many, many individuals who are prone to chronic anxiety. If I tell you the symptoms of non-integration, so terrible anxiety, chronic anxiety, often hypersensitive to all sorts of things. It can be to lights, to sound, to touch, to textures. These are the fussy eaters. You can even measure it by shining a light in the eye, and the pupil won't constrict as quickly to light. It's like being a deer in the headlights. It makes you very controlling. Generally, these are individuals who dislike change, who can't handle it, who need routine, who need to know what's coming up. It makes you prone to mood swings, physical timidity, a lack of self-confidence, and longer term, it's linked to hyperglycemia, it's linked to the development of phobias. We've treated many adults with phobias, particularly spatial phobias, driving phobia, agoraphobia, fear of heights, etc. And they've had a retained morrow reflex, and another called a TLR. And the thing is, it's one of those things that because it's coming, all of these reflexes come from the brainstem, the lower brain. So you can't exert conscious control over it. So no amount of, for example, talking in therapy about your terrible anxiety issue is going to work.
It's not going to help.
Coming from reflex. If it's coming from a reflex, it's hardwired in.
Sure.
And the only way you get rid of it is these movements.
So what sort of movements would you be doing, and how long would you have to do them for to get rid of something like the morrow reflex?
Yeah. So the movement that we do is, we call it the flower, and it's a very slow, controlled, in effect, a morrow movement where you're starting off with the eyes shut, the hands flat, the head is down, and you're slowly opening up the arms and the legs, and importantly, the chin has to come up and be beyond the level of the spine. We're doing various touch counts during that, and then we're slowly reversing the movement back down. And it has to be very, very slow and very controlled. And you'll find individuals with a morrow will hate this movement because they've spent their life trying to avoid the morrow being elicited. And you can tell at the beginning, they'll put the head off to the side, or they'll scrunch their hands, which makes it not work, because this is the palmar reflex and it inhibits the morrow. So
flat hand, have you?
The hands flat, exactly. And you repeat this, maybe sort of 3-4 times. If you can do it twice a day, that's fantastic, even better. And bit by bit, it will let go. And I do have to sometimes warn parents that it can get worse before it gets better, because we're stimulating it. We're giving it the stimulation it didn't have the first time round. And I remember warning one parent of this, and she rang up and she said, well, my little son, he's getting even more tearful. He's getting even more clingy. He doesn't want to go into school. And I'm going, that's great. That's terrific. It's working.
Really, it's working.
It's brilliant. I'm glad to hear it. And then finally it went. And he was truly transformed as a result. In fact, he's a boy that lost a diagnosis of Asperger's. I mean, we didn't just do that. We did other work with it. But he completely lost his diagnosis. And he was about to be asked to and was being bullied and things. So, but the morrow can have a massive impact on functioning. And it takes longer for adults to get.
Does it? Yeah. Well, of course, because you've lived with it, for maybe 40, 50 years. It's interesting there that you talk about heightened senses. And this is something that I've had
Yeah.
personal experience from people close to me who have hypersensitive hearing. And I know that through the auditory work that you do, and this is something again that I learned, is that our ears, we have muscles in our ears that we can retrain. So I know somebody who was hearing a lot through their right ear and very little through their left ear, which you and your practitioners in your clinic identified. And through literally just having a few weeks of listening to sounds on headphones, very specialist sounds, you were able to rebalance the workings, the inner workings, the muscles of the ears. And so now that individual hears equally through both ears and is much calmer and much more settled as a result. I mean, is that a fairly common part of your work, one of the strands of the therapies that you're using?
Absolutely, absolutely. The auditory work's really important, and it's very often ignored or not looked at.
Mm.
But often difficulties and anomalies, really, in the way in which someone's hearing sound can have of course, has a direct impact on the brain. It's one of the stimuli that comes into the brain, and we know, for example, with dyslexia, that there is always a sort of auditory processing issue that tends to go with it. But very often I'll get people coming to the clinic that say, well, I've had a hearing test, my hearing's all completely normal, I don't have a problem there. And what they mean by that is they've had a hearing test and no hearing loss has been identified, which of course is really important, but nobody has assessed how they're hearing. So as you quite rightly mentioned, you could have an individual who's been told, well, you've got a normal hearing test, but they've got through the roof hypersensitive hearing. And I've had quite a lot of individuals hearing, minus 10 decibels is the quietest thing you can test on an audiometer, and they're hearing everything up there. And they're very distractible. They can't block out background sounds or because they're listening to what's happening 3 classrooms away and they can hear the overhead light bulb. So just taking that and bringing it down to a normal level can have a big impact on functioning. We find autistic spectrum, for example, people on the spectrum tend to have this very hypersensitive hearing, and it can make many social situations completely overwhelming. So, maybe the withdrawal isn't because they don't like being with other people. Maybe it's just because it's too loud in there.
They can't cope with the noise.
They can't cope with it. So that's one very basic thing that we can do. You mentioned dislateral hearing, and that's a really interesting one. It basically means that some individuals jump from one ear to the next to tune into different bits of language. So we know, for example, vowels happen at one range and consonants at another and sibilants at another. Now, if you're jumping from one ear to the other, it has a direct impact on the order in which phonemes are received and processed by the brain. And this is simply a question of wiring. Sounds that go in your right ear go immediately to the left hemisphere, which is where they get processed, the left temporal lobe. If it goes in your left ear, it's got to go all the way over to the right side of your brain, then it's going to make this great big journey over to the left side before it reaches the bit of the brain that's processing language. So that can have a weird effect on the order of sounds coming in. So if I say cat, you could hear act if you were tuning into the A with your right ear and the C had to make this great big journey, the lower sound was making this great journey. Right, so this is an individual who then is told, well, they're dyslexic or they write things the wrong way round. You're hearing it the wrong way round. They've got terrible spelling. Well, I wonder why, if you're not hearing it the right way round, and you've got to associate that with a pattern of letters on a page. What on earth are you... So with all of these things, with the reflexes, with the auditory, if you have these sort of glitches, the higher brain has to get involved and unscramble the mess. So you're not necessarily conscious that's what you're doing, but you're using up all this vital grey matter. You're kind of wasting it on having to, deal with poor balance, deal with eyes that are jumping around on the page, deal with mixed up sounds coming in from the ears. And then you've got to answer the question you were asked. So, what we're basically doing, getting the system to function as it should, making it all happen a lot more easily for individuals. And, when they're not wasting their energy on on the need to perpetually compensate, then they start becoming able to access their true level of intelligence and capability. And, it's not just their grades and everything that jumps. And I explain to parents, so I'm not making your child more intelligent than they were. I'm just allowing them to access it for the first time. But it also shores them up emotionally, because what I've also found is the individuals who are jumping through all these internal hoops, for whom, the autopilot's not quite functioning. They're already under a high level of internal stress, just coping with the day-to-day. And for those individuals, all it takes then is something external to happen, something difficult, and they're the ones who are more susceptible to falling over into a sort of anxiety or depressive state.
Yeah.
So, if you take away that internal stress, you're also creating emotional resilience to cope with things.
Your work, I have to say, is so life-changing for so many. It's really actually quite emotional talking about it, because yes, it's really important to, to get people right. But when you're looking at smaller children who have all these external stresses or internal stresses that they simply can't cope with and can't control, they get misdiagnosed, they're not treated in the right way. And in those formative years, as any parent listening will know, this is the time when you're forming your friendship groups. You are perhaps, at risk of exclusion. You then suffer from self-esteem. You might fall into gang culture. You might then be tempted to have an outburst of uncontrollable violent behavior that you can't control, which then may put you in a young offenders situation or give you a criminal record. I mean, the impact of these, what you're saying, are very simple things that need to be explored. They need to be explained. And, I've seen people do your auditory therapy, for example, where, you take all this noise away. And it's very simple. It's a few weeks of sitting with some headphones on, listening to 20 minutes of very specific music. And, when you do it, you think, well, this isn't going to help, is it? I mean, come on, this is, you're just having a laugh, aren't you? Some sort of strange quack clinic. But, no offense. But, but at the end, you get amazing results. And it's just astonishing.
Yeah.
And I just so wish that more people were aware of this, which is, I guess, the reason for my podcast today.
Yeah, well, I think that's the thing. I think the single biggest barrier is a lack of awareness, because when people do then look at it and they look at the research studies behind it, because we're all about evidence-based interventions. And I think this is information that drug companies don't necessarily want you to know this. They, if you've got a child that's having difficulty concentrating, you're only ever really given a couple of options. You can prop them up eternally with extra tuition and extra learning support, or you can reach for medications. And people just aren't aware that there are viable alternative strategies that can be taken. And as I said, sometimes in the short term, people need to take the medications. But I just think it's not a long-term panacea. I think there are smarter ways that we can go about things.
Okay, so
and the years, as you said,
No, you go.
No, I was just saying, with the ears, it sounds so strange to say just listening to music, but when you understand that the ears have muscles and they have reflexes, they actually have the equivalent of a zoom lens. You can retrain them to zoom into or away from a sound up to 30 decibels. So what we're doing is we're giving the ears a physical workout through the auditory therapy. We are getting them to jump and the reflexes to work in better synchronicity. And we're literally changing the hearing profile, because we do audiograms before and afterwards, and you can physically see this hearing profile changed. Yeah.
Before we go, Sarah, I do just want to touch on something that you said just now, which was about the use of medication. And I imagine that a significant proportion of young and old clients who come through your clinic doors are on some form of medication. What percentage come off medication or significantly reduce medication following some of your protocols?
Sort of depends what the illness is that they've come there for, or the difficulty. I would say it's somewhere between 80 to 90% for ADHD are able to come off their stimulant meds.
No, really?
Can I tell you? Yes, they're able to come off it, because you're having exactly the same effect. With antidepressants, I would say it's at least the same. Depending on what it is, as I said, it's 98% for postnatal depression. But if we're looking at undermethylation, overmethylation, overmethylation just requires some folate to be given to a reasonable degree. Undermethylation, we're looking at SAMe, methionine, we're looking at things that have the same effect as an SSRI, but unlike an SSRI, you don't have to keep dialing up the dose, because we're actually allowing the body to produce more serotonin if we're undermethylated. We're not using up which is why SSRIs, you have to keep dialing it up, because you use up all the serotonin that's there. The work Dr. Carl Pfeiffer did with schizophrenics, he was able to take schizophrenics who were quite extreme and had been institutionalized, he was able to take them down to 20% of their regular medication dose. Now, that was the difference between them having horrible side effects, putting on weight, becoming suicidal, and not. So, it may be that for some individuals, you just have to dial it down. You're always going to need some medication. We'll keep it at a low level. But, my feeling is, why not at least explore? If you can get these things happening alongside, in parallel with the medication, and very often they then say, well, I'm not feeling that I need that anymore. Let's take it down. With with their doctor's supervision or our doctor's supervision, until they're eventually able to come off it. So I'd say for the vast majority, it's something that's very, very effective and it works.
That is amazing. I think we should leave it there on such a positive note. Sarah, I'd love to talk to you again. Thank you so much. We will put all the details in our podcast notes, but essentially everything is at the Key Clinic. And I think, am I right in saying you now have 2 clinics, one in London and one in, is it Berkshire?
We do. We have one in West Berkshire and we have one based in central London in Devonshire Place. We've also got a couple of satellite clinics, one down in West Sussex and one up in Liverpool. And we can also deliver our therapies remotely.
Yes.
The biomedical side, we get test kits and things sent to people's homes, so that's fine. And as I said, we've got a lot of
It sounds like there should be a Key Clinic in every city, every town, every postnatal unit in the country. Sarah, thank you so much. It's lovely to talk to you, and I hope that we can just help amplify some of the extraordinary work that you and your team are doing. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure, Liz. Thank you.
Well, I hope you agree with me that that is all completely fascinating and a subject that is definitely worth revisiting in the future, which I certainly intend to do here. Because that is it for today's episode. Very big thanks to Sarah. And as always, you will find the links and the resources that we mentioned here over on lizearlewellbeing.com. And there you can also sign up for the free weekly newsletter. It's filled with plenty of healthy recipes and good tips for living well. Very many thanks to all of you who have left such lovely reviews for this podcast. It always helps others to find the show and perhaps in turn to find the help that they need. So thank you for taking the time and also for clicking those 5 little star review rating buttons at the end of the podcast. That's also super helpful and very kind. So thank you. Until the next time we chat, go well. Bye-bye. The Liz Earle Wellbeing Show is presented by me, Liz Earle, with production by Amaryllis Earle and Harry Trevithick at Heart Dialogue, with thanks to my producer, Ellie Smith, assistant researcher, Martha Comerford, and guest booker, Millie de la Morinière.